You're having such a good time with each other, it's hard to interrupt. I want to apologize. I was the person who promoted having Professor Ingram come speak here, but and I feel very, very bad that she is not here. I had a huge anticipation of being able to finally meet this person, and who I admire. And so I will begin with reading what I had anticipated as being my introduction. I first encountered Professor Ingram on YouTube during the beginning of the drought a couple of years ago. While searching on Google for information on the past historic rainfall statistics for Northern California, I saw a tab for a video titled California Colloquium on Water, featuring Professor Ingram as his principal speaker. And it turned out, for me at least, to be an enormous eye-opener. I've always prided myself on my knowledge of history, particularly social, political, economic, military history. However, it turns out my knowledge of natural history is woefully deficient. As I quickly discovered watching Dr. Ingram's tour de force on YouTube, which I highly recommend. I've since watched it 4 or 5 times, as well as reading her book, The West Without Water. I think there's another person in this room who read that book too. I highly recommend it as a primer for anyone in public policy in elected office to read this book. Discussing my findings with other people revealed that they were as much in the dark about this topic as I was. What I take away from this is that given the great importance of environmental history to the human community and the human future, overcoming this ignorance should be a first-order priority. We are fortunate to have bright, dedicated, and innovative and industrious individuals such as Dr. Ingram and her team at UC Berkeley, leading the way in advancing our knowledge and insight in this critical field of human inquiry. Breaking down the topic, actually, it comes in, I would say, 3 different elements. The first element is something about the cyclical nature of the climate that we live in, both of large cycles and the smaller cycles. The second thing is, of course, the impact directly upon the state of California, and thirdly, what might be the logical mitigations that we would face in the future. First, I want to refer to, as she does in her book, the interesting fact that I never realized until encountering her work was that we're actually living in a protracted ice age. It's been going on for about 1 million years. And that what we're living in right now, our own small little period, is a period of what they call interglacial warming. And if you look at the past climate history of the world as studied through the ice cores from Greenland and Vostok, you find that the climate has gone through these 100 to 125,000 year periods where most of the time we're in a dreadful period of cold. Where I previously thought we had maybe an ice age in the past, sometime it was an anomalous event. Actually, it's a reoccurring event. And within this ice age, there are many sub-ages, even within our warm period. We're all very familiar with the cycle of the moon and the tides, and that's an immediate cycle we're familiar with. But one of the things that Dr. Ingram and her team have done is they're what I would call, they're empiricists. They go out in the field and they dig holes in the ground. They go out into the bay, muds and marshes, and they sift through the remaining debris of the tribal people who lived here before, the shell mounds that were left behind, etc. And they actually take these back to laboratories where they take this material apart in its layers and study the oxygen and carbon components to determine what the temperature was, what the water content was, the salinity content, and all the rest of it, this highly detailed information. And the San Francisco Bay Area, and of course Stanford and Cal, are uniquely benefited by the fact of all the bridge building we've done. Because if you look at all the bridges that have been built here, to build them, they've had to dig these cores out to go down to bedrock. And in those cores are about a 600,000 year history of the bay. The comings and goings of the ice ages are there, the rise and fall of sea level, and many other things that are very important in understanding our climate. They've not only done that, they've gone up into the Sierras, hiked in and lived out in the backwoods there, studying the levels of the different lakes, the stream beds, and gone out into the western United States to take a look at some of the anomalies that are found all over the desert lands, recognizing at one point in the past these desert lands, actually much of it was a Great Lake. In this process, what they've discovered is there not only is this large interglacial set of cycles, but there's also a set of smaller cycles that deeply affect us. And that's where she studies in her book the nature of what is apparently about a 450 to 470 year cycle of dry and wet and cold and hot. And the other part of what she studies in her book, and I think this is something I found very amazing, is that our weather that we live in here is actually cooked up on the other side of the planet. And if we're talking about, the thinking globally, this precipitation pattern, like the El Nino, et cetera, that we live through, much of it originates in the Indian Ocean. And if you remember your geography and you look at the globe, you can see this vast water that is adjacent to where we live. Most of the mass of the surface of the earth is this water that is right out here. And through mysterious processes that we're only beginning to understand, the water gets cooked up, and we end up with periods where we have this like an El Nino, because this water is traveling a 10,000 mile journey, and then it comes and it meets the geography of the western North America. And when it meets this geography, it meets California, and California, as we know, is we come across the shallow waters that come up to the coast. Then we have our mountains here that are on the coast. Then we have a valley, and then these very high mountains. And then that energy of hydraulic energy then meets a desert, and then on the other side of the desert, even more mountains. And it's a very dynamic situation. We can hardly think, we live in probably one of the most volatile climate areas on the planet. And the search for stability in climate for us, particularly in terms of our water situation, is going to be a very difficult task, because nature, we must actually find ourselves to be somewhat humbled by nature, because we are subjected to this set of periodic events. Now, another event that is something that I had no knowledge of, and I'm sure that most people, probably in this room, and certainly almost nobody that I talk to when I discuss these findings has any knowledge of, which is the episodic flooding that affects the state of California. And this episodic flooding has, interesting enough, a mean period between of about 207 years. If you were thinking about it as like a probability curve, the beginning of the curve would be about 175 years, and the longest would be about 350 years. Now, how this is reflected in the history, the oral traditions of the Aboriginal people that lived here in California, was that they were constantly reminded in their oral tradition of the great floods that came and washed away their ancestors. And as a consequence, they were constantly looking at the sky, always looking up, always in caution. And it is actually probably the reason, if you think about it, as to why California never developed until we came along any permanent human settlements. And this is a very interesting thought to think about. Why is it that no permanent human settlements came before we came along? And since then, of course, we've had epic development that has occurred here in the state of California. The natives that lived here never built things except somewhat along the coasts. And that leads me to want to describe the paradigm of what she talks about, the epic periods of mega-droughts. And we've never had a mega-drought. And when she talks about a mega-drought, the high evidence that there have been in our past periods where there are decades without rain. Decades. Not just a year or two or three or a slight fall off, but a period where you have like 70 years of almost no rain. Think about our water demands in the context of that. However, one of the benefits of public planning is and behavioral responses, it's fairly easy to adapt to the droughts, because they come on over a long period of time, and you have a period to do some adaptation. The other side of this coin is that these mega-droughts are punctuated by these intermittent mega-biblical levels of flooding. And to describe, as she describes, the 1861 mega flood that affected the state of California, and this is what I think almost nobody is aware of, is that there was a rain that came into the state of California. It was a period of 43 days of torrential rain without stop. It was like the sky that flows from the far side of the earth lifted up a river of water, an immense river of water, a river larger than the Amazon, into the sky and poured it down on the state of California for a period of 6 weeks, leaving the Central Valley a lake that was 300 miles long by 70 miles wide. Bankrupted the state of California. It led to the city of Sacramento being underwater. The stories in here from the chroniclers of the time talk about the people in San Francisco rising to the occasion of gathering all their food all their boats and sailing up the river to feed and evacuate the people in Sacramento. Something most people have no idea happened. A gigantic heroic effort on the people that were living in San Francisco at the time who took that responsibility almost spontaneously on their own. A great human achievement. After the flood was done, the water had only three ways to get out. It was either to go into the ground, evaporate, or to flow out down the Sacramento River, out the bay. And so for months the draining occurred. And of course, along with it, there was 800,000 head of cattle. Now, there was hardly anybody living in the Central Valley relative to today when this occurred. And if you think about the Sacramento River having to drain a lake this size out into the ocean, given the tidal effect, half the day it was a dam, a pushing back of the tides. And if such an event were to occur now, given the immense infrastructure, the huge populations, think of whether or not the public health situation would be sustainable. For the people living in the Bay Area, they would not have to evacuate. And yet this is a topic completely undiscussed at any level of government. It is like almost like a secret that would best be not discussed lest it affect the development plans that the California development situation on steroids that's going on now. And so when we think about this, the other thing we think about too is, given this kind of precipitation, we have this infrastructure of dams and wastewater facilities all over the state of California that are necessary to sustain not just the life that is here in Northern California, but these dams which capture the snowpack also are the sustenance for much of the life in Southern California. And are these dams capable of withstanding such a hydraulic event? Has there been any engineering studies done to make a determination as to whether or not this whole system of hydrology that we have built up to sustain this high level of population would actually withstand this? And the reason why I'm bringing this up is a very important topic, and I think it is probably one of the key topics in this book, is because by mid-century we're going to be in the middle of that high probability curve. And we are going to now have to start thinking about ourselves like those Aboriginals. We're going to be looking at the sky. And looking at that sky, not just for the rain, but also for the fear that the rain might come, and a rain might come that does not stop. And so, as I said, it's one thing to be creating adaptations for the dry periods, but then again, we also have to start thinking about adaptations for a period of extreme flooding. Now, if we look back over we're living in what we call, since the end of the last glacier period, glaciation, we're living in what they call the Holocene. And as we move through the Holocene, what is happening, we're noticing, particularly in terms of this flooding cycle and their analysis of it, looking at these cores, is that these floods are getting more extreme. So as the warm period continues and moves towards its peak, these flooding periods are going to become ever more extreme. And so this brings up, of course, to me, the question of what do we do? Now, I know that if we're looking at the dry periods, we can be looking at building more dams. We can look at desalinization or conservation. Those seem to be the three major topics. As far as the flooding, the only thing I can think of is geoengineering. Now, the only hope in this direction, if we think about the air currents that go across the oceans. I don't know if any of you have heard of the facility in Alaska. There's another facility that was built in Puerto Rico called HARP. If you're looking to be familiar with it, a fellow named Nick Beggish is, if you remember, his father was the congressman that died with Harold Boggs mysteriously in Alaska some time ago. I think you're shaking your head. You remember Harold Boggs. Yeah, Harold Boggs. It is essentially a DARPA project, which is a defense research project, where they're actually able to cook the ionosphere and literally lift up that part of the atmosphere underneath which these flows of water are moving. And the question, of course, is whether or not you could actually engineer a way to reshape the atmosphere at a certain level so as to move these currents of water about as they move about the Pacific. Now, that's a completely speculative idea. So outside of that, I really don't know of any other technology to deal with this, except to begin some kind of a process of discussing what kind of emergencies we must prepare for. And that's going to require, I think, a long political discussion amongst policymakers. And I think that at least what I think this book is, this book represents an opportunity to begin a conversation that I think needs to begin. And then the other side of the cycle, to return to the drought and the issue of human development here. We have been fortunate. We've got a fairly good snowpack this year. We've had good rain. But is this something we can continue to rely upon as we continue the process of developing out and actually thinking of expanding the population of California by 50 to 100% over the next 50, 70 years? Because by the time we get to that 70, 80 million person point and filled up the Central Valley with endlessly new housing developments and human settlements, we'll be just about at the midpoint of the probability of 50% every year of a return of this disaster. And secondly, in the way as we approach this, how are we going to find the water along the way in a kind of interesting kind of paradox to supply the lifestyle that all these people are going to imagine they're going to be able to maintain with them? So again, these are questions that need to be answered at the highest political levels before I think we continue with these development plans. So there is what I have to say on the subject, and we'll be ready to talk about some stuff.
So I'll work my way around the room, starting at this table, looking to take one question per table and then coming back. But we'll take questions and answers till about 1:15 or so. So, any question or comment here at this table? Going. Okay, all right. Anyone here at this table? Sure. Yes.
Who's your press?
Clayton, in her book, she talks about how they're reading tree circles. Did you come across that, or was that in her video, and what that shows?
The tree, most of the tree work, I think, as I'm remembering this, of course, This is almost like a book review in a sense, which I haven't done since I was in school many decades ago. But the tree circle work they did, a lot of it was up in the Sierras, and this is where they studied these mega-droughts, where you see there are some trees up there that are extremely ancient, and you might think of them as survivor trees. They have been able to survive weather cycles that basically would have made most other plants on the planet perish away, even as a species. And that's where the evidence comes from that talks about these decade-long spells where there was no snowpack. I mean, literally none for decade after decade. And the water levels of these lakes basically came down to the point where they were basically almost dried up creeks, which can be measured by the salinity and other factors. And that's why, and we have been living in a very wet period here. We've been in kind of the Garden of Eden as far as precipitation and rainfall for the state of California.
Okay, other questions, comments?
I'm just going to say, anyway, Eleanor Sluice. My concern would be, again, how to work with different agencies. I don't think this is on. Especially in restoring the wetlands, because it's my understanding that by restoring more and more wetlands and stopping development, that will give us 50 years as one person to get ready for the big explosion in 50 years, which also doesn't take into consideration the idea of the probability of another earthquake here.
No, let me address, that's something I wanted to, actually I forgot to get to because I have all these piles of things and notes. Yeah, California, you're talking about the institutional response. We have, luckily, and this is one of the things I wanted to bring up with Professor Ingram, if she had been able to make it here, was her proximity at the University of California. And her mentor and her, Doris Sloan, they come out of Stanford. So you've got we have an intellectual resource, a scientific and technical resources in the state of California that I don't think any other place has on Earth. And I think that we need to engage that resource to do, not just to study the science, the empirical basis of the developing better models of predictability, but to do outreach and public education on the subject, and thirdly, to actually begin to look at the technologies to begin utilizing some, and to begin looking at rebuilding a lot of the infrastructure of the state of California so it'll be survivable. And as far as the wetlands, yes, and she goes into this in great detail, and of course she has a huge affection from having tromped around in the marshes out in the Delta, the political issues around the peripheral canal, and what this means to being able to have sustainability for our environment here. And unfortunately, and this is something I look at, and this is my own, I'm speaking here, is the reality of California as a unified state. I mean, when you're thinking about Southern California and their outsized political influence on the outcomes politically in the state, and the problems of getting any focus on conservation. I mean, here we have abundance and self-sufficiency in water, and we have we are the star pupil as far as conservation, and yet you look at Southern California and it's really like getting them to, and I think as long as they are able to steal our water, not to be too harsh on them, the behavioral model is just not there to change behavior, because they can always inflict their pain on the rest of us. And until that changes, I think there's going to be a difficulty in doing major work in holding, particularly in what I'm talking about, is the delta, which is so important as the major piece of this ecology that you're talking about.
Okay, we've got another question or comment here.
Hello, Marsh. I don't think this is working, is it?
It is, if you hold it real close to your mouth.
So I haven't read the book, but I'm just curious to know whether the author talks about the impacts of carbon emissions from man-made activities since the Industrial Revolution, and if that's discussed at all.
She gets into this briefly at the end of the book, but what she focuses on in her book is essentially everything that is empirically been completely justified by her. Although she does talk about the fact that this increasing temperature that we're having at the moment, if it continues, will of course make the episodic volatility more severe. So you'll have more severe dry than alternating more severe wet. Which is probably evidenced in some respect. If you go back over time, we should expect that the next flood maybe, instead of being 6 weeks, would be 8. And maybe bring 20% more precipitation with it than was with the last flood, until we finally peak out on this interglacial period.
Okay, Charles.
This going in. This whole argument throws a lot of doubt on the global warming whole hypothesis, and it gives ammunition to the warming skeptics. And it makes it really difficult for politicians, people making policy. Because it's one thing to say that man-made global warming is resulting in these conditions that are going to be destructive. But it's another thing to say we're part of a gigantic series of cycles, that global warming is only a little tiny tick in, and that whatever we do is simply going to have a small effect on the overall progression.
Oh, good. That leads into a couple of things I wanted to touch upon. Basically, my philosophical inclination is Buddhism. And an interesting fellow who's I've become friends with, a sensei, Bada from the Buddhist Churches of America, as a friend named Ken Tanaka, and he has written an interesting book called Ocean. And there is both self-power, which is, you might say, the human behavioral component, and the will of people. And there's also other power. And this leads into another thing, what you might call and I highly recommend this, something called the electric sky, which is a study of what it can be rightfully looked at as the fourth state of matter, which is plasma, which is being researched now fairly intensely as we begin to develop all these probes out there into our solar system. And we're beginning to actually measure the electrical activity that our galaxy emits to this planet, our solar system, into which we live in an effect of. And so, yes, I think that you have, on one level, you have our impact, but as I said, the humbling factor is that we do live in nature. And I have studied, as I said, all manner of behavioral stuff, history and economics and all the rest, but one, my ignorance of natural history. Because we come out of nature, and nature has its own history that's being written irrespective of ourselves. And we have to understand that not only is there a proactive element in this, but we need to develop a consciousness of a reactive element. Because if we have such a rain come, or we have an extended period of dry come that we have no control over, we have to develop a consciousness that is a reactive consciousness to what, as a Buddhist would say, would be to the effect, the living in effect of the other power as opposed to self-power. That's not to take away from the one, but I think that we have overemphasized the one and underemphasized the other, and I think it could lead to great danger to us.
Okay, I'm taking more questions from this table because a couple of tables passed. So Greg, you take a chance, and then we'll take your question too.
You mentioned these two huge threats, mega-droughts and mega-floods, but either I missed it or you were a little light on proposed ways to address them when they happen. I think in response to mega-floods, you mentioned geoengineering. I don't know if you have more specific things in mind of that, but mainly I'm interested in if there are any proposals to deal with a mega-drought. I would argue that we've not been dealing very well with our current drought, which of course is tiny compared to the kind of thing you were mentioning, where 3 or 4 years we have slightly reduced rainfall, and we're trying to reduce water use by 25% and barely making it. But you're talking about decades, 70 years you mentioned, with little or no rainfall, with no snowpack. I've seen projections of dramatically reduced snowpack, but I've never seen projections of no snowpack for years or decades. You mentioned that we could probably adjust and adapt because we'd have years or decades to do so, but how on earth could we, with this population or even a fraction of our current population, much less an increased population, adapt to little or no rainfall for years or decades and no snowpack?
Well, that unfortunately, it's that, like I came out here when the mamas and papas were popular with California Dreamin', and it is kind of interesting that even our author, when I was talking to her on the email, she came out the same year because her father was working on the Apollo project, like I came out, and I worked at Space Technology Laboratories, designing trajectory systems down in LA. And so, yes, a great dream. And I'll tell you, California is one hell of a great dream. And that's why everybody wants to be here, and why the price of real estate here is like astronomical. And you travel across this country, and people look at what you pay $700-800 million for in Marin County, and they scratch their heads and they can't understand it. Well, this may be turned upside down. And that probably one of the adaptations in that kind of a situation is going to be either, first of all, I think it would be massive conservation. And a massive effort to re-engineer how we take what water we get, such as all that water that I wash my vegetables with that goes down the drain, all the rest of the, we have not scratched the surface. That's what I was saying about, we have an engineering oversupply in some respects here. We have this hugely educated population and highly underutilized talents at Cal and at Caltech and Stanford, and and not to mention all the private companies here. So I think that we have the mental capacity and the engineering skills to go along with a deeper way. We haven't even started because, there's a kind of short-term, lazy thinking in the government. The government is driven by the financial interests. The financial interests want to build more stuff, bring more people, and let go of the problems of tomorrow until they actually show up on our doorstep. That's our responsibility, which is to want to get our legislators up to speed. The other thing is the issue of desalinization, which is a very unpopular topic here, particularly with our Mr. Sanders fan, who has led the charge on that one. Many of us participated in the anti-desal thing. But desalinization brings another huge problem, which is it requires an immense addition to the electrical supply. And quite frankly, unless I think you're willing to go nuclear, you're not going to be able to do massive desalinization in the state of California. And again, the problem with nuclear has to do with earthquakes. And the only way and I want to give an engineering answer to your question. Back in the in the 1960s and the early 70s, the director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratories, Dr. Alvin Weinberg, developed a technology called a molten salt reactor, which had high levels of safety inherent within it, and very little, no proliferation risk. It was really the key to a cost almost free energy future for the human race. He lost the battle with Richard Nixon and Admiral Zumwalt, and we ended up with a high-pressure reactor technology developed that we have today. Now, I belong to a group of people that are called the Thorium Energy Alliance, and we have been working diligently to advance the cause of Dr. Weinberg's work. Even the leading person, Baroness Worthington, in the House of Lords, who's the leading Green in England, has assembled an all-party conference to develop get this technology out. The only people who are really seriously working on it, interesting enough, is the Chinese National Academy of Sciences, under the direction of the son of the last premier of China, who's been given the budget to actually redevelop, because we actually had developed this reactor here, and it basically was scrapped by Nixon in favor of something that would have produced beaucoup plutonium for nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, we're caught there. And that's, I think, the only sustainable future clean energy source that could actually meet this challenge.
So, Clayton, let's see if we can get to, I've got a question here and one there, and then I want to see if there's anybody at that table, and then we'll be wrapping up. So, Al, quickly, let's.
Yes, Al Dugan. I'm a candidate for Marin County Supervisor District 4. I hadn't read this, but thank you for this great summary. But we discussed a little earlier Stanford Climate and their dynamic Earth group study has a more focused review of the current times. And basically, to simplify it, they say instead of a quarter of the days being warm, half the days are going to be warm. And we're going to have 4 to 6 year cycles with very little water and then a lot of water. What does she address that particular microcycle we're in right now, which they're saying is going to be the next 30, 40 years? Thank you.
Not directly, but indirectly, she talks about the fact that at this point, we've pretty much, it's a difficult thing to say, given all the contrary interests involved. But in terms of sustainability, we have reached pretty much the peak of what we can expect to maintain at this standard of living in the state of California. Now, we experience that in traffic pretty intensely all the time now. But I think that from what you're saying, if in fact their studies turn out to be true, you're going to be washing your clothes less, driving a dirty car, and it's just and unfortunately this goes back to the issue in the Central Valley that they're faced with, which is, and she brings up in the book, that the floor of the Central Valley is in some places sunk over the century by 35 feet. The exhaustion, we've been living off of an aquifer, which has given us a false sense of comfort, much like the people in Arizona have been draining the aquifer that was formed by the Colorado River. So yes, I would say that if that is the case, then the development plan, well, of course, one of the problems about addressing, I'll tell you why I think, honestly, the issue of development is linked indirectly to the issue of the deficit in pensions for the state of California. I think that the model for dealing with the pension deficit disorder at the state and community level is the fact that they're going to try to, quote, grow their way out of this problem. And that's the only way they seem to be able to think of doing it. But if you look at the economics involved, at how much money is available, how many economic resources are available, can you both pay off these generous benefits while at the same time having the funds available to re-engineer all of these systems that need desperately re-engineering, let alone maintain the existing infrastructure and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, as I said, this conversation must begin. It has to begin with some information. But I think ultimately it comes down to making, again, another one of my favorite books is, these are books that are just floating around in my car, choice. We have some choices to make. Recently I've been taking it's kind of interesting, the new corporate mentality. I've been taking a mindfulness and meditation course from a gal named Lee Treckle, who is a mindful and meditation coach at Pixar, doing this work with the Pixar executives. And one of the things that really comes up in this mindfulness issue is choice. We have actual choices to make. You know, Buddhists are kind of stoic kind of people, but it's about responsibility. People of California don't want to take responsibility, then they will have, they'll have to take it'll be like rolling the dice or going up the grate and pulling on the lever and just eat the results as they come.
All right, Clayton, we've got another question here, and then you'll be our last question.
You didn't mention...
closer to your mouth, right up to your mouth, and speak loudly.
You did not mention tertiary water from sewerage as a resource of that. And that is something that would go with any human population. And I think Israel and other countries have mastered that. And even when we had the last drought here, there were two, Livermore and down in Southern California, there were only two water districts that did have tertiary treatment of human water.
Okay, yeah, she's talking about taking sewage and reconverting it into potable water. Again, this is at least on a massive scale. What you're looking at is something that's going to require a lot of energy, and I think it's going to require a lot of chemistry. And one of the let's admit it, that we in Marin County get to go up to the tap and drink water that is probably close to Fiji water as a benefit. I mean, go to some places you can't even drink. If you get in you drink the water and you wonder if you should take a shower. I have friends who have family in Israel, and I have to say that they're not that exactly happy with the technology there. I don't want to speak for other people about this, but at least what has been spoken to me is that there are a lot of complications with this in Israel, and there are desal issues that have not been resolved. And of course, there also is, once you do that filtering, what do you do with the waste? You know, because you do generate a lot of waste in desal.
Okay, question here, Bill.
You spoke of the people of California will sort of have to do something now, or otherwise 50 years from now, there'll be big trouble. Can you think of any time in history when something 50 years away that was having no particular effect at the present time has motivated people to take whatever action would be necessary 50 years from that period of time? Thank you.
Well, there's a kind of global thing in what you're saying about perspectives. And what I'd like to say to that is that, first off, I'd like to be hopeful. And secondly, I think that we are actually at a turning point in human history as a consequence of the information revolution. We do have the ability now to really be informed in ways that we were not before. And I'm hoping that, and I know this is like perhaps what you might think of as wishful thinking, but there are societies that actually have thought long term. Not necessarily democratic societies, but perhaps we can have both our cake and eat it too and have a democratic society while at the same time enjoying some level of long-term planning and thinking. And in terms of an epiphanal type of moment, I'm thinking back to MacArthur's speech as related to me in Norman Cousins' book, The Pathology of Power, to the Ohio National Guard, to the Ohio American Legion in the mid-1950s, when he came out in favor of not only nuclear disarmament, but actually he became a peace freak and called for a change in the international view towards ever going to war again in any major way. And if someone as hidebound as we consider him to be could go through such an epiphany, I think that there is a possibility for the rest of us. And I'm going to hold the door open for him.
Okay, Clayton, we're going to squeeze in one more short question. And John.
I'm wondering if Dr. Ingram is addressing the chemtrail spraying that we can very readily see in the area. I'm taking medication of that.
Okay. Yes, I've seen the chemtrails, and I'm very clear that they exist. They're not false. They actually are going on up there, and I think that the measurements that have been taken up in the Shasta watershed, the heightened amount of aluminum oxide that they're finding up there is true. What that is about, I'm uncertain. I can only speculate on what's going on, and as a consequence, and she makes no address of this. I allude to it, the fact that we have to look at perhaps geoengineering at some point will be looked at, because we are, a technologically based society. So we're going to do that. Well, what is the effect of that and why they're doing it and who is doing it is a secret to me as much as it is, I think, anyone else. But there is an organization against geoengineering. I think last week or this week we're having a demonstration in Sacramento. So if people want to Google them, you can find out more about it online. Thanks.
So for having a speaker who is pinch hitting and filling in,